Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulullah. Okay, so in essence, what I'm going to talk about is actually having a conversation with somebody who's doing some research in this, and it's more or less the same issue, which is when we did, I think last year we did our first conversation. It was about Muslim safe spaces, and I remember one of the questions. It was somebody asking about how, but they couldn't get their head round how somebody who knows religion, has studied religion, can then actually do, abuse. How does that work? They just couldn't get their head round it. And I was trying to say, well, they're a human being, and human beings can get things wrong, but they just could not get their head round this. And I think this seems to come up over and over again, which is the core of what I want to get to today. And what I'm presenting today is not just for ourselves, but I also think it's the key messaging we have to be giving to our communities, inshallah ta'ala. Scholars can be corrupted by power and ego, and that is basically the long and short of it. People find this difficult to understand, and the reason they have difficulty understanding this is because they're hearing things like, there's the hadith, I'm sure. I have reiterated this hadith many times, and you hear it in khutbahs, that the ulama are warathatul anbiya, they're the inheritors of prophets. So this is a messaging that we're giving our communities. The scholars are the inheritors of the prophets. So then obviously the logical question is, well, how can then these people, or some of these people, be doing these types of behaviors? And I think what seems to get lost is that scholars have gone through an education system, of course, and they come out, but they're not a finished product, right? They're work in progress. Like anyone, like any profession, you're not the same person when you graduate in your first year of your career that you are in 20 years or 30 years or 40 years, right? It's the exact same thing. And scholars have egos, just like everybody. We're human beings, and if you're a human being, you have an ego. And what's supposed to happen is that obviously you go through a religious institution, and then you're supposed to learn about the ego, and you're supposed to work on your ego. That is the theory. The nature of the ego is what? The nature, well, there's many things we can say about the ego, but what's relevant here is the ego veers towards power, position, and status. This is very well known from our tradition. And unless you work on the ego, it can translate into abusing others, right? And so in that sense, scholars are not like a distinct group. They're like any other profession. Anyone who is in a profession, we see it in different professions. It comes in the news every so often, such and such has abused their position, and they either have to resign or they're taken off or they're struck off, or whatever it may be. And scholars are no different. Scholars can fall into the same trap as anybody else. Why? Because of the ego. And so if scholars are not working on themselves, in other words, working on their egos, then they remain susceptible and weak. But the difficulty is that in our community we give a lot of respect and a lot of praise. And guess what? The ego loves that. So if you're somebody who's went through an institution, you've learned about, you know the theory. It's like tajweed, you know the theory, but unless you practice it, you're not going to have good recitation. You can know as much theory as you want. If you studied the stuff but you don't actually practice it, then you go into a field where you're given status, you're given position, you're given praise, you're given respect. That's feeding into the ego as well. So what's happening to the ego? The ego's getting bigger. And that's why, although everyone's supposed to do this, it's extremely important for the scholars to be working on their egos every single day. This is work which is supposed to go on all the time. Now, there is a problem with the Islamic education system, and many scholars don't want to admit this, but it's the truth, where a lot of the focus is on academia. So, memorizing Quran, going through the 6 books of hadith, reading tafsir, this tafsir, that tafsir, right? They'll have a big list of their chains of narration and all the books that they've studied. And you see this in bios, you know, I used to see this all the time. Studied with this scholar, done these books and so forth. It's all academia, it's all academics. But what is missing is real hard work. Real hard work is missing. The academia side of it is getting taken care of, but the hard work is not happening or is lacking. And this is not a new issue. This is not something new that's specific to our time. This is something which has been happening for centuries, which is why somebody like Ghazali, who's famous for his Ihya Ulumuddin, this is what he witnessed. In fact, and this is interesting because we often say, well, okay, Ghazali talked about this and he mentioned all these diseases and how to get rid of them, but how long did it take him to get to that conclusion? He went through the madrasa system at the time. The madrasa system didn't give him it. He became the scholar of his time. He was at the head. He was the principal. Other scholars were coming to his circles, and his ego was through the roof. So the academia side of it did not help him with his ego. In fact, it probably made it worse. Right? So it took him a long time. If you think of it, it took him a long time before he actually saw the trap of the ego. And then it took him time he had to step away and go and spend years reflecting, working on himself, and then he came back to be the finished article. So if that was Ghazali, and there's not many Ghazalis in our history, then what about some Darul Uloom graduate, 6 years? You know, we put him as the Imam, he's in his 20s or something, and you expect this person to be, you know, some person who's like conquered their ego. It's not fair, and it's not practical either, and it's not reality, right? It's a delusion. And the thing is, Ghazali is an environment where he's in the Islamic system, he's surrounded by scholars, he's surrounded by scholarship, and this still happens to him, right? So I think this is where we have to look at scholars. They are work in progress. Some are working harder than others. Some are being a bit negligent. But what we are taught in these, what they are taught in the Islamic system is the tools. They're taught the tools. So, you know, very often, and you know, scholars would say this to ourselves as well. After you'd finished a stint, they would say, "Look, you haven't studied everything, but we've taught you enough that you can now read these tafsir books yourself. You've been taught enough that you can go and read this hadith book and go and search for yourself." Then it's up to the scholar to work and to research and to develop their scholarship. They don't get everything in those 6 years. So if that's in academia, the same thing is going to be in hard work, ego work. Right? They have the tools, but they have to now go and work on themselves. Now, one of the things I think, although, like I said, Ghazali was talking about this centuries ago, and he was warning other scholars, because once he'd been through it, saw the trap, he then started to warn others through his writings. And you know, he famously, and there's a chapter in his book, which is the chapter of knowledge, and he's really talking to the scholars. He's asking them about what is your intention for learning, what is the purpose of it, and he's really pushing them to think. But one of the things I think which is unique or maybe different in our times is that now with the advent of social media, things like WhatsApp, Zoom, I think what's happened is it's made obviously communication easier, and with that, it also removes barriers. Dr. Hendrik yesterday was just mentioning, you know, with social media, how people behave, the comments that they think they would never say it in a physical space, they would never say it in a space like this, but online they would do it. So there's certain things about that space which removes barriers. And so then what happens is it makes the slippery slope more slippery, right? So for example, Zoom calls, right? If you go into a Zoom call, the expectation is you have to put your camera on, isn't it? Everyone's got the camera on and you don't want to put your camera on, you're the odd one out. And then some people actually say, "Can you put your camera on?" So there's almost like an expectation. Now when the camera's on, I can't just look down, I've got to look at you. Otherwise that's rude, you see? So there's certain things about these phenomena that we have now, which we didn't have before. Before you could just maybe have spoken to somebody. Or in the physical space, if you lowered your gaze, it's fine. But on a Zoom call, you can't do that. Everyone's looking and you're looking down, right? How rude is he? And this is how the devil gets in. So I think this is where the complacency can sometimes come in, because you become so used to it, before you know it, it's just become normal to you. Something that maybe you're uncomfortable in the beginning becomes very comfortable. Then another issue we have is, again, social media, because now you're on social media, everyone's like, you've got to be on social media, otherwise people won't know where you are and they won't know who you are and they can't connect with you. And with that, well, we can't just say, what's your USP? We have to promote this. Okay, this is sacred. What makes it different from other organizations? So you get into marketing and they say, right, okay, well, and so because of all of this, there's a lot of exaggerated praise. The esteemed scholar, Fulan, is coming, right? His Eminence. These are words, you're laughing, but these are words, we all know which scholars are called these things, right? Hazrat, right? Qibla, the scholar of our time, one of the most distinguished scholars. All of these things, there's exaggerated praise and inflated claims in the name of marketing and social media, and this feeds the image of perfection. It feeds the image of that scholar who's got the knowledge, and then we're assuming that he's also got the inward reality. He's got his ego under control. And then, in fact, and this is because I dealt with a case, in fact, last week, a preacher who's on the circuit, and his wife was saying one of the things that attracted me was what other people were saying about him. Other scholars were praising him. I thought, this must be the man, right? So I think there's a really big problem with putting scholars on fake pedestals, especially the famous ones or the celebrity ones. So Ghazali's talking about this in the Book of Knowledge. Why is he talking about this? Because he knows scholars are susceptible. He knows these are traps they can fall into. So he's telling them, look, these are the traps. And the ego, guess what, loves false hype. So you're getting all this hype, and you get it on social media and people are liking your thing. Oh, mashallah, you did this for me and you said this for me and changed my life and blah, blah, blah. And what happens is you're not working on your ego, you can fall into that false hype because the ego likes it. And you say, mashallah, alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah, yeah? But you're actually just massaging your ego. It's got nothing to do with praising God. And I understand, of course, I get it. Scholars should have a higher standard. They should be better than the average person. I get all that, right? And if they've been given a position in the community, they should be taking that responsibility seriously. But the truth of it is, they're human beings. And if you're human, you can fall. If you're human, you can sin. And if you're human, then Allah is saying, وَخُلِقَ الْإِنسَانُ ضَعِيفًا. The man was created weak. We have weaknesses. So breaches of trust can occur in any power situation. Teachers, politics, the police, doctors. You just look at the news, you see it all the time. And religious figures are the same. Because it's that same issue of power, and the ego is attracted to that, and if you're not working on it, then why wouldn't you fall into that trap? And Ghazali's talking about these things of insincerity. Why is he talking about it? Because he knows it happens. And why are we making the scholars an exception? Like they're a different class? No, they're like everybody else. They're like everybody else. I mean, and not everybody, again, who may seem what they are what they are. I remember when I was studying in Syria, we were told, when we were studying, we were told there's certain students of knowledge, be wary of them because we think they're working for the government. So they were in our classes, they're talking to us, befriending us, asking lots of questions. You're like, is this guy on the payroll, right? So you can't just assume that everybody is there and they are who they are. The very famous story of Nurdin Zingi when he gets the dream of the Prophet ﷺ telling him to come to Medina, that somebody's trying to, get into his grave. What happens? He sees it. He knew the two people. These were two people who had hired a house next to the grave, and they looked outwardly pious. They weren't even Muslim, right? So not everything is what it seems. And this is not, if you look at our tradition, there's lots of statements about, bad scholars or evil scholars. I'll give you one. This is this is Ibn Abdul Barr. He said, it is said that the worst rulers are far from the scholars and the worst scholars are near to the rulers. Now, I'm not going into the actual statement. I'm just saying that these statements were made. So they recognize there are sharul ulama. There are bad scholars. Imam Malik also said that everyone's words can be rejected except the person who's in this grave, meaning the Prophet. So it doesn't matter which scholar you are, how big you are, everyone's words can be rejected. They're not Quran, they're not Sunnah. And obviously we know that our religion is about talking the truth and justice, even if وَلَوْ عَلَىٰ أَنفُسِكُمْ, even if it's against yourselves. And then we have also hadith, which is very clear. The first people to be judged in the next life. Who are they? The martyr, the person who gave a lot of wealth, and who else? The scholar. The scholar who was insincere. He was not doing it for the right reasons. Right? So this is actually in our tradition. And so not every scholar, not every imam studied because they had a burning desire to serve the religion. It could be the dad's a scholar, the granddad's a scholar, that's just what they do. They're from a scholarly family. You're expected, it's like doctors, isn't it? Father's a doctor, mother's a doctor. It's expectation, they become a doctor. So it could just, in some countries, it's a way out of poverty. In Pakistan, India, a lot of times, they'll send them to madrasas because at least they'll get fed there. They'll get clothed there. We were talking yesterday about somebody who went to an imam for advice, and they said, send them to a madrasa. That'll help them, that'll correct them. So not everybody is going to become a scholar because they want. It's not everyone that did hifz of Quran, who memorized the Quran, did it because they had a burning desire to memorize Quran. The parents made them do it, or someone else made them do it. We say, oh mashallah, this guy's a hafiz, So, and then also, maybe they've had difficult upbringings. They've got their own traumas that they're struggling with themselves. And they're maybe even struggling to follow the Sharia themselves, and their imams are scholars, right? Because they're human beings. And so, when we come back to that question of how can this happen? Well, it can happen if the heart is corrupt. And we all know the hadith, there's a morsel in the body, if it's corrupt, the whole body's corrupt. If it's sound, the whole body's sound. It's the heart. Ala wa hiya al-qalb, isn't it? Well, if the heart gets corrupted, and the heart can be corrupted, then it makes sense. Well, how can somebody a hafid of Quran and commit this crime? Because the heart's corrupted. The Quran has not benefited their heart. There's a block. The knowledge is not getting through. The blessings are not going through. The understanding is not coming through. Because how else can you explain a hafiz or a mufti or somebody who's teaching, the Quran day in, day out, then going on to say, for example, abuse children? How is that possible? It's not possible. It's because that knowledge has become like a vocation. It's become, it's not penetrating the heart. It's just something they do to earn a living. Then the culture of reverence. I think there's a big problem we have. And these two quotes are from Sayyidina Amer. So again, from our tradition, we see this is not how our early scholars or even our Sahaba understood religion, that, people are perfect. They're not. And we also know that Amer, there's another quote. He said, "O people, I do not send governors to you to flog you, or to take your possessions. I send them to teach you your religion and the path you should follow. If anything other than this is done to a person, you should raise the matter with me." Meaning what? Amer understands that people abuse power, abuse positions. Right? He understood this. He understood this very well. That's why he's got a procedure, a complete procedure. I think the story of Salman al-Farsi is really interesting. So for Salman al-Farsi, as you know, he's in search of the truth, and it takes him a long time. But think about his whole journey from the beginning to the end. He goes from one priest to another priest to another priest to another priest, eventually gets sold into slavery, comes to Medina, and then finally he's got this man, but he doesn't just take his word for it. He's got signs. He goes, sign number 1's there, right, goes back, comes back, sign number 2. He takes his time. He observes from a distance before he commits himself to this man. And that approach, which is a companion approach, is a Sahaba, teaching us that you don't just take things face value, you take your time. So there's many assumptions, I think, which we've kind of covering, but very, very quickly. Believing scholars are awliya. Believing scholars are friends of God. Well, I don't know. Nobody knows. No one knows who is a friend, who is not. But we just assume, he quotes all the scripture, he must be a friend of God. Who said that to you? Where did you get that from? Do you have access to that knowledge? No one has access to that knowledge, right? We don't know what's going on behind doors. We're only seeing the person in public. And again, it's really interesting because when you start speaking to people, the kind of things they start saying. I mean, one brother was telling me just about how young people view scholars. He says, but when they see that this person's got 100,000 people following them, they think he must be good. He must know what he's doing. Otherwise, why would 100,000 people follow this person? So again, making assumptions. And then, that's kind of celebrity culture. It's almost like, oh my God, I got to take a selfie with him. Oh, he looked at me. He said salam to me. It's like, subhanallah. And this thing about not questioning the scholar, it's a very big problem, that you cannot question the scholars. Well, how do we see, this is the thing that they say, well, our elder said, okay, such and such scholar said, fine. But let's go back to the seerah, let's go back to the Prophet and the companions. Did the companions question the Prophet ﷺ? At times they did, right? We know the story of Badr. The Prophet was about to settle, and one of the companions said, Ya Rasulullah, is this revelation? No, it's just my opinion. Well, my suggestion is, and what does the Prophet say? Great suggestion, let's go with it. So that he did not feel he's Rasulullah. And we're like, oh, he's Shaykh Fulan. Who's Shaykh Fulan? The Prophet of God. This is the Prophet of God. The incident of Barira, which I think is really interesting. So Barira, he's following his ex-wife around Medina, crying in public, and everyone's got feeling sorry for him. She doesn't want anything to do with him. She's just been freed, and he's not. And the Prophet ﷺ sees him in anguish. He's crying around the streets. Everyone's like, And so the Prophet feels sorry for him, says to Barira, like, why don't you just take him back as your husband? She's got a child with him as well. What does she say? Does she say the Prophet of God who gets revelation, the best human being ever, has just told me this piece of advice? She says, is that an order? Do I have to do it? And he says, no. She goes, well, no thanks then. He just said, no, I'm just interceding for him. Now, the reason I'm saying this is because we can't question the Shaykh, but the companions didn't have this understanding. So where's this coming from? It's not coming from our tradition. So the Prophet ﷺ had created an environment where the vibe he gave was not, I am the Prophet and you must listen to me under all circumstances and I know everything, right? He created an environment where people felt safe to disagree with him on his human opinion. But some Shaykh Fulan in our time, we can't question him. Where is this coming from? It's not from the Seerah. So we can't prevent abusers, but we can equip people with tools to protect them from becoming victims. Domestic abuse, as you know, there's billions spent every year. It doesn't end domestic abuse. There's laws, there's all sorts of things, right? So we can't stop this, but what we need to try and do is equip people, strengthen people. And the first thing we need to tell people is that nobody is above the law, right? Yes, scholars, leaders, they've got a set role, maybe they're teaching Quran or whatever, but if they use that for alternative reasons to get money out of you, to get you to do things against your will, then that's a breach of trust. And we have to make that very, very clear. Nobody is above the Sharia, right? The Prophet ﷺ, this is a very famous incident, I know time's going, so I'm going a bit quicker. But in this incident where they were trying to reduce the punishment for theft, the Prophet ﷺ made a statement and said, even if my daughter, you're talking about Fulan Shaykh, he's talking about one of the best women ever, did this, she'd be punished. Nobody is above the law, right? So we need to teach people about boundaries of trust. Khalwa, there is no exceptions. You don't make exceptions. Your khalwa is being alone with a person of the opposite sex in a place where nobody can get access to. Your nakedness, your aura, nobody sees it. There's no exceptions to this. There's no you can't make exceptions to this. People asking you for money, you're in this really bad situation, but if you give me £1,000, cash of course, right? Not bank transfer, cash, then I can help you, right? This is the kind of stuff that we need to be calling out and making it very clear over and over again to people. The need for Seerah, I'll just give you a few examples, because I think when you go back to the Seerah and you see the dynamics between the Prophet ﷺ and the companions, no one can disagree with you, no Shaykh can disagree with you, everyone gets it. And if we just start concentrating on that, then we have to say, this is what our religion teaches. Everything else is questionable, but this. So someone was saying to me, we were talking about, yesterday someone said, yeah, but the person said that his teacher, the students used to massage them. And I said, okay, did the Prophet do it? Did the Prophet have Abu Bakr massaging him and other people? So if you just take it back to the Seerah, we've got this example. It doesn't matter which scholar from which century said it. I don't care. Did the Prophet do it? Do we see this in the understanding of the companions? No, we don't. So I've only got a few minutes. I'm going to quickly go quicker now. So the kind of questions we need to teach people is, look, first of all, is it in accordance with Sharia? This thing that you're getting asked, does it match with the Seerah? Does it match with what we're teaching you about the Prophet and the companions and how they were? Does it agree with the spirit of religion? In other words, do you think God would be happy with this? And then, does it feel wrong? Because that's that internal radar that we have to alert people to, because there's many hadith like this. Sin is what irritates you, your heart. Istafti qalbak, ask your heart for the fatwa. Wa in aftuka al muftun. Even if the mufti gives you the fatwa, does it feel right? Does it sit right? Does it resonate in you? Then you have red flags. I don't have time to go into this, but the red flags that we need to teach people. The first one would be, obviously, don't tell anyone. Don't tell anyone. I had a mufti that was doing this with a female student. Don't tell your parents. That was in the text. If it's nothing wrong, why can't I tell my parents? Why the secrecy? Because as we know, most abuse happens in silence. You've got this problem. If you give me this much money, then you'll get the problem solved. I had a brother he was telling me about a month ago, some, again, religious person said he saw the Prophet mashallah, in his dreams, and he told him that this business venture he's about to do is going to be, it's a no-brainer. And he goes, because people trusted that person, thought, the person, why would they lie about seeing the Prophet? Obviously it was a scam. Right? And the thing is, we have to teach people, look, people do this all the time. Maybe not religious scholars, but you go to certain countries, beggars will say, for the sake of God, oh, I'm from Palestine, on this, that, whatever. Right? People will use religious texts. I get it in my own arena when it comes to marriage. One side will say, tell them what Islam says about the rights of women. The other one's like, tell them what Islam says about the rights of men. Right? It's whatever you can give me that helps me bolster my position. So we do see it, people doing it. But obviously, spiritual abuse is slightly different. So just finishing off very quickly, key messages: taking every allegation seriously, known abusers not to be moved around the mosque. This is unfortunately happening, and just actually understanding it is in our interest to remove these people. And these people can be difficult because they're embedded and they have connections and networks and so forth. And we have to be very clear. I mean, you saw the report to make it very clear this is absolutely going on. Absolutely going on. I think everyone knows of cases. I see cases all the time. Every wali, even if you think it's a person, we don't know who's a wali or not, only God knows, but even if you think this person's a wali, just remember the wali can commit a sin as well. And again, I think it's a really key point at the end. We can't prevent abuse, but the aftercare, if it's done properly, can make all the difference. So when that person takes that step, the reaction they get can make or break that situation. And my final slide is just a final question I want people to ponder over, is what makes people vulnerable to spiritual abuse? Right? In other words, if we can figure out what are the vulnerabilities, then we can start thinking about how can we strengthen those so that people are less vulnerable. Inshallah, we see less of this type of situation, because I know it's not a comfortable topic for anybody. It's a necessity. We're having to talk about it because of a necessity, not because we want to. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us tawfiq. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammad wa alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam taslim. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin.